It's about all the people of the unnamed land to the east. Quote, the first part of the word is the Hebrew har, meaning mountain. And with the remainder, Sareth, he compares Cirrus, the name by which the Chinese were known to the ancients. What's interesting is that during these same centuries, the steppe route was in its prime. If you're wondering what the steppe route is, it's the Silk Road before the Silk Road that these Yaśarelim would take advantage of those unstable periods, flee north, and join this eastbound pipeline. They left their mark in Japan through the history of Shinto shrines. Rabbi Yirmiyahu Ullman says, quote, a Shinto shrine resembles the ancient Jewish temple.
The Israelites, we believe their purpose was to spread it across the Silk Road. When you look at history, it does. And I'm not that type of guy to be like, oh, I think you are. I found this because the Japanese people themselves are reporting on TV that they think they're from the House of Israel because of the legends and the connections.
It's a migration known to have occurred during the first millennium BCE. And you can see it and its time frame on this map thanks to the Atlas of Western Prehistory. Now, Arsareth is essentially referring to China, Siberia, and its connection to Alaska. Interestingly enough, that same region overlaps with what's known as Arphaxad.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up out of your sleep! Sleep!
What you call the ancient kingdom of Israel was actually a sacral chiefdom, a shamanic theocracy called Yaśarel. It was a short-lived but powerful empire that briefly became untouchable until the chiefdom split in two, north and south. The north kept the name Yaśarel, whereas the south adopted the name of its biggest tribe, Judah. They were on the brink of civil war, so the north tried to gain military support from the Neo-Assyrian Empire. However, the Assyrians feigned allegiance only to catch Yaśarel off guard when they instead launched the first of several military campaigns to conquer one city-state at a time. The war between Yaśarel and the Assyrian Empire resulted in northern Yaśarelim enslaved and forcibly herded like cattle out of the Promised Land. These were masses of Yaśarelim from as many as 10 tribes, but these weren't all the northern Yaśarelim. In future presentations, we'll discuss how whole clans of them avoided capture, but the ones who were captured and enslaved did eventually escape Assyrian slavery. The age-old question, though, is where they went after that. This is the first of many presentations in which I will trace the exact routes of their migration. If you've never heard of Arsareth, you probably haven't studied the Lost Tribes very much. All Lost Tribe theories have to address Arsareth because of 2nd Esdras chapter 13. The author is said to be Ezra, which is impossible, but we'll deal with that later. Verses 40 to 48 say, quote, those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Osea the king, whom Salmanassar the king of Assyria led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. We're going to identify that land momentarily. But they took this counsel among themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country, where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. Okay, so that's 2 more lands mentioned. The second one is this further country beyond the first land that the Assyrians actually put them in. The third one is obviously the Promised Land. We need to identify those first 2 lands. Continuing. And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. That part's important, for the Most High then showed signs for them and held still the flood till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely, of a year and a half. And the same region is called Arsareth. There it is. There was a great way to go through that country. Through that country, not into that country. Arsareth isn't actually the destination. It's a region they went through to reach the destination. Okay? What does the word Arsareth actually mean, and why would this author give this name to a region they traveled through? The most popular theory is that this proper noun comes from Deuteronomy 29. Look at verses 24 through 28. This is after Yahweh just explained all the terrible curses Yaśarel would endure for breaking their covenant with her. She's describing that, and she says, quote, "Even all nations shall say, Wherefore hath Yahweh done thus unto this land? What meaneth the heat of this great anger? Then men shall say, Because they have forsaken the covenant of Yahweh Elohim of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other Elohim, and worshipped them, Elohim whom they knew not, and whom he had not given unto them. And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against this land, to bring upon it all the curses that are written in this book. And Yahweh rooted them out of their land in anger, and in wrath, and in great indignation, and cast them into another land, as it is this day." End quote. Where it just said, another land. That's Eretz Aharath in Hebrew. The word Arsareth is believed by Jewish scholars to be a corruption of that original phrase, which just means another land. If they're right, this corruption likely would have happened because the author of 2nd Esdras is literate in Greek but struggles with Hebrew and was trying to make a Hebrew proper noun out of this phrase despite reading it in Greek in the Septuagint. More on that later. Hungarian Rabbi Solomon Schiller Senesi is the one who theorized this idea of it being a corruption of the phrase another land. He's credited with this thought in the Jewish Encyclopedia. While I do consider this logic sound, I want to explore an even more plausible explanation. Always check the rabbis because they've been keeping our language for us for centuries, but also double check them because their diaspora made them lose track of things. In Volume 3 of the Journal of Philology, the perspectives of several other scholars are provided. It's mostly just a bunch of feeble attempts to point to Armenia so that the lost tribes could be found along the migratory routes of the Ashkenazi Jews going into Eastern Europe. But none make as much sense as Rabbi Schiller Senesi's theory. With one exception, Arthur Marie Lahire is a French scholar who explained that a simpler explanation might be that, quote, the first part of the word is the Hebrew har, meaning mountain. And with the remainder, Sareth, he compares Cirrus, the name by which the Chinese were known to the ancients. End quote. Yeah, China, it should be Harsareth, but the H gets little to no voice when it comes at the beginning of a word, so it might not even be written. This is also an even more likely combination of words for a Greek writer because it's simplistic, yet it changes only one character to create a phoneme whose difference can be attributed to the subtle contrast between Hebrew and Aramaic. This would make perfect sense for someone, possibly a real Jew, who spoke both Aramaic and Greek because Cirrus was the Greek word for China, Mongolia, and parts of Central Asia. The mountain part will matter later, but I'll explain that near the end. As it so happens, scholars separately but widely agree that chapters 3 through 14 of 2nd Esdras was written by a Jew because that portion's earliest manuscript is in Aramaic. That's mainstream enough to be supported by Encyclopedia Britannica. Quote, the central portion of the work, chapters 3-14, consisting of 7 visions revealed to the seer Salathiel Ezra, was written in Aramaic by an unknown Jew around AD 100, end quote. The reason all this matters is because Arsareth wasn't a specific place to our ancestors when they originally wandered in the wilderness between Canaan and Egypt. But centuries later, when the empire split and the northerners were taken away, the southern Yaśarelim developed an addendum to their extant crossover folk tradition. What do I mean by that? The crossover folk tradition is the ancestral belief among ancient Yaśarelim that all Hebrews originally migrated to Canaan from Sumer before there ever was a such thing as Yaśarel, presumably requiring them to cross over the Euphrates River in the process. Genesis 11 verse 1 says the whole earth had one language, but earth here is Haaretz, the same word from that phrase the colonizer butchered to make the word Arsareth. It does literally mean earth, but only as in soil, so while it can figuratively refer to the whole world, it usually just means whatever land we're talking about. That verse is saying the whole land spoke one language, not the whole earth. What land's it talking about? The next verse tells you. It says the people of that land journeyed from the east to settle in Shinar. So the land these people came from is a land east of Shinar, and those people all spoke one language. The next 7 verses tell the story of the Tower of Babel, and the people of this Eastern language group all get divided by Yahweh splitting their languages, which creates a bunch of cultural divides between an otherwise united people. This has nothing to do with any language groups in Africa or Europe or anywhere else. Again, it wasn't talking about the whole world, it's about all the people of the unnamed land to the east. Okay, now this Eastern culture splits into multiple ethnic groups, and the latter half of the chapter identifies those ethnic groups for you. Each name you see is a tribe from the Arphaxad Confederacy, which is the name of the tribe that fathered all these tribes, so to speak. The Arphaxad Confederacy consisted of the Shlaw Nation and the Aber Nation, but the Aber people were considered to have come from the Shlaw Nation. The name Aber is yet another one of those Hebrew words that actually starts with an H. But since you barely hear that in Hebrew speech, they leave it off in text sometimes. Remember Arthur Marie Lahire was arguing that the same thing's happening with the word Arsareth. The word Aber shows you how that works. The adjectival form of Aber is Ibri, and in Germanic languages we translate Ibri as Hebrew because of Latin influence. It literally means across something, as in on the other side of something. Gesenius's Hebrew Chaldee lexicon defines it as, quote, region on the other side, situated across a stream or the sea, end quote. We already demonstrated that they came to Shinar from the east. We need to know what Shinar is to know what's east of it. A 1990 article in the Harvard Theological Review definitively declared, quote, in the light of these observations, it is uncertain whether Shinar derives from Sumer. In spite of the linguistic difficulties, however, the two must in some way be connected. End quote. In other words, Shinar is Sumer whether the word Shinar comes from the word Sumer or not. That's the scholarly consensus. If we go back to Genesis 11 again, you'll see that it ends with the house of Terah, and Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Verse 28 says Haran died in the land of his nativity, which it says is Ur of the Chaldeans. Verse 31 further confirms that Ur is the land of Abram's nativity. Ur was a Sumerian city-state in what we now call southern Iraq. So the Arphaxad Confederacy came from further east than Iraq. When they arrived in Sumer, they joined the indigenous people of that land, which we'll talk about in a future presentation. But the point is that their folk tradition claimed an origin from the Far East. And don't forget that Arsareth is well hypothesized to be a mountain or mountainous region in what we now call China. The Har in Har Saris was supposed to be the Hebrew word for mountain, right? We'll get to the mountain part soon. Just hang on. Now, if you check Gesenius's Hebrew Chaldee lexicon, you'll see that Sanskrit has a probable cognate for Arphaxad, which is Arjapakshata, and it means by the side of Asia. Scholars usually assume this refers to the western edge, but if they came from the east, it would have to be the Pacific Rim. That's China and Mongolia, so the ancestors of the Hebrews probably migrated from China to Sumer. But the idea behind this whole Aber thing is that this name has to do with being across something or crossing over something. People usually say it's either because they crossed the Euphrates to get to Canaan, or that the Israelites later settled across the Arnon River opposite Moab, or that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea on dry land, or crossing the Jordan River to enter the Promised Land. But these theories don't make sense. How could they have already been known as Hebrews before crossing the Euphrates if that's the thing the name was for? That goes double for anything the Israelites did, since their actions shouldn't reflect on the entire ethnic group from whence they come, and since the ethnic Hebrew identity appears to be established among the Arphaxad peoples centuries before Israel existed. The only logical explanation is that the crossover folk tradition was retroactively applied to the name Aber by Israelites of a much later period when the original meaning of the name had been lost. We'll cover more on the origin of the Hebrew name and identity in another video. But when did this crossover concept enter the picture if it wasn't relevant in the beginning? Josephus famously said, quote, "Wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated in numbers." End quote. He wrote this in the year 93 CE, about 20 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, and 7 years before the bulk of Second Esdras is believed to have been written. Mind you, Josephus himself was a Jew, albeit likely an Edomite Jew, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it in another video. What this proves is that there was a tradition among a community of Jews who lived comfortably in the Greco-Roman realm for some reason, at a time when most Israelite Jews were being slaughtered, enslaved, or chased into Africa by the Romans. This protected Jewish community still had pride in the Israelite traditions, and one of those traditions was the idea that the lost tribes were beyond the Euphrates somewhere, possibly in the lands of their prehistoric ancestors of the Arphaxad Confederacy. This was a thing. The way we think of the Promised Land is how they thought of the land of Arphaxad. They were returning to the motherland. It was an idea that had probably been pervasive in Judea for a long time already. They knew about East Asia because that's where their own ancestors came from. But this is right when the kingdom of Judah has finally been obliterated by the Romans through multiple wars. It's in the aftermath that we see this oddly safe Jewish community with the likes of Josephus, and whoever the hell wrote Second Esdras, acting like it's a known fact that the lost tribes are east of the Euphrates. But is there any evidence that earlier Hudim, from periods when the kingdom was still standing strong, already believed this? As a matter of fact, there is. 2 Kings 17 verse 6, quote, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes," end quote. This was almost definitely written by a bunch of Yaśarel scribes during the Babylonian captivity of Judah, which would mean it was written in the 500s. CE Samaria was the capital of Yaśarel after the empire split in two. It was in the territory of the largest clan of any tribe, a clan called Ephraim. The Assyrians took the capital and put the captives in 3 places. They were put in Halah, Habor, and multiple towns of the Medes. Keep in mind, the bulk of the captives from Samaria should be Ephraimites, so this doesn't necessarily address other tribes. Halah and Habor both start with the letter H, but this H actually has a diacritic dot under it in both cases, indicating that it's supposed to be pronounced with a glottal scraping sound. When you write this with English letters, you're supposed to either use the H with the dot under it, or start with a letter that makes a Q sound like K or C, but you keep the H and just put it after the K or C. I'm explaining this so we can identify these place names. You'll notice that Strong's Concordance spells Halah, C-H-A-L-A-C-H, and defines it as a region of Assyria. See if you can find this same name in Genesis 10 verses 10 through 12. Quote, "And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Ashur, and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same is a great city." End quote. We're back in Shinar, and one of its cities is Calah, which is Halah. That's just south of modern-day Mosul, Iraq, which is east of the Euphrates River, see? If this was already understood when 2 Kings was written, that illustrates that it could have become part of the folk tradition by the time 2nd Esdras was written. What about Habor? Don't forget it said Habor was on the river Gozan, which makes it easier for us to pinpoint where this city is. Today, the ruins of that city are called Tal Halaf. Encyclopedia Britannica describes it as a, quote, archaeological site of ancient Mesopotamia on the headwaters of the Kabur River near modern Ras Al Ain, northeastern Syria. Skipping down to the next paragraph, it also explains, quote, "The site was recorded around 894 BCE as the tributary city-state of Gozan by the Assyrian king Adad-nirari II," end quote. So, the city of Habor was on the river Gozan, but later the river became Habor and the city became Gozan. They just switched names over time, and this is still east of the Euphrates. Lastly, let's find the cities of the Medes. We'll make this simple. Here's a map of the Assyrian Empire. If you look to the easternmost part of the kingdom, you'll see the cities of the Medes. That's in Iran. These are the starting points. So, we've just identified 3 starting points for the diasporic migrations of lost tribes. Here's the thing though, it's not as simple as saying all 10 tribes went one way, so in this video we're only tracing 4 of them. The 3 starting points we've identified only apply to 4 of the lost tribes. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 26. Quote, "And the Elohim of Yaśarel stirred up the spirit of Pul king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tilgath-Pilneser king of Assyria. And he carried them away, even the Reubenites, and the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them unto Hala, and Habor, and Hara, and to the river Gozan, unto this day." End quote. So, by the time 1 Chronicles is written, which is a century after 1 and 2 Kings was written, the tradition among the Yaśareli scribes was that those same cities with one additional town were the places to which the tribes of Reuben and Gad were taken, in addition to the clan of Manasseh. When we read 2 Kings, it said the people of Samaria were taken to these locales, so that adds the clan of Ephraim. Manasseh and Ephraim comprise the entire tribe of Joseph. Lastly, the tribe of Levi must also be included because they inherited no tribal territory of their own. Instead, each of the other 11 tribes gave spaces in their territories to local Levites who were the priesthood of the chiefdom. So the Levites among the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the clans of Joseph would have been included in this. So this was likely written in the 400 CE, and the scribes of Judah seem to have more information than they had 100 years earlier, because now they know which specific tribes were taken to those places. This suggests the Hudim must have confirmed that those tribes were in those towns. Confirmation would probably have come naturally when the Babylonians conquered all this territory, because they also conquered the Hudim. They forced the Hudim to live in Babylon, which briefly brought the Hudim just a couple days south of Habor and Kala. They probably had sparse but direct contact with these lost tribes again from time to time, though that contact would have been limited. But 1 and 2 Chronicles were written after the Hudim returned to the Promised Land, which we know because it was all one manuscript ending with verses that mention the decree of Cyrus the Great to rebuild Jerusalem and return Judah back to its rightful place. By then, they had confirmed which lost tribes were there, so this information was added to the folklore of the people, passed down through the generations thereafter.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
What's interesting is that, during these same centuries, the steppe route was in its prime. If you're wondering what the steppe route is, it's the Silk Road before the Silk Road, and if you're wondering what the Silk Road is, it was this major network of trade routes connecting the Promised Land and Turkey all the way to what we now call Mongolia and northern China. The steppe route was the exact same thing, but further north. It went from China and Mongolia through the Pontic-Caspian steppe of Siberia, all the way to the Carpathian Basin of Central Europe. This trade route connected a lot of Eurasian cultures both directly and indirectly, and people traveled this pathway long distances. The Scythians, for example, were one of the Huns, which were Siberian tribes, yet they actually sacked Nineveh in 612 BCE, which was the heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They traveled a segment of the steppe route to even reach the Assyrian realm. Quote, but on special occasions, the Scythians could assemble large numbers of horsemen for long-distance raids, such as the one that helped to bring the Assyrian Empire to an end. After sacking the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BCE, the booty-laden Scythes returned to the Ukrainian steppe, leaving Medes, Babylonians, and Egyptians to dispute the Assyrian heritage. End quote, Encyclopedia Britannica. What this proves is that the Assyrians were well aware of ethnic groups as far away as Russia, and the steppe route was undoubtedly responsible for that kind of long-range interconnectivity of distant cultures from damn near opposite sides of Asia. These facts are huge because Kala and Habor are actually super close to the Asia Minor corridor that connects to the western leg of that steppe route. They could travel straight north past Mount Ararat and follow the west coast of the Caspian Sea as it curves east. The steppe route already carried natural traffic flows in both directions, nomads journeying east and west constantly. In the late 7th and early 6th centuries, the region destabilized as the Medes overthrew the Assyrians, and the Babylonians took advantage in all these territories. It's only logical to consider the likelihood that these Yaśarelim would take advantage of those unstable periods, flee north, and join this eastbound pipeline on the steppe route. Do we have any other reason to think they did that, though? Don't forget, Josephus as well as the unknown Jewish author of 2nd Esdras were both under the impression that these Yaśarelim in Assyria were beyond the Euphrates. But the unknown Jew appears to specifically be referencing the Greek word for China, which is the mouth of the steppe route. Har-Seres makes much more sense as an Aramaic adaptation of the Greek designation for northern China because Har is mountain in Aramaic just like it is in Hebrew, and the lingua franca in Judea at the time this was written was Aramaic. In classical antiquity, Jews spoke more Aramaic than Hebrew. The word Arsareth is an attempt to make an Aramaic version of the word. So what's left of the Jewish population in Judea after the Jewish-Roman wars is a community of Jews whom the Romans view as their own, for reasons I'll explain in a future video. Regardless, the Jew that wrote the middle of 2nd Esdras tries to make it seem like he received a vision that revealed what happened to the lost tribes, which is a lie. He was piggybacking off of an idea that Jews in his generation already believed, which was that the lost tribes went to northern China. The tribes of Raubain and Gad plus the clans of Yosafi dispersed at the other end of the steppe route into a Semitic society of Turks and Proto-Mongols. They left their mark in Japan through the history of Shinto shrines. Rabbi Yirmiyahu Ullman says, quote, "A bar Shinto shrine resembles the ancient Jewish temple. The entrance to the shrine is in the east while the shrine is in the west. There is a laver near the entrance for washing hands and feet. The shrine is comprised of a courtyard, an inner holy section, and an innermost holy of holies. The Holy of Holies is elevated above the holy section by stairs. Worshippers pray in front of the inner holy section, but only the priest can enter the Holy of Holies and only at special times. A Japanese omikoshi resembles the Ark of Covenant. It is similar in size, overlain with gold-winged figures on top. It is carried on the shoulders with poles while accompanied with song and dance. The carriers must immerse themselves beforehand, and a special ceremony whereby the bearers carry the ark through a river is reminiscent of the biblical description of the Jews carrying the ark through the Jordan River on their way into Israel. There are other similarities as well. The Japanese Shinto priest's robe often has cords hanging from its corners, resembling Jewish tzitzit. Also, a certain type of Shinto priest called a yamabushi wears what's called a token, a small black box on the forehead between the eyes, tied with a black cord behind the head. This closely resembles Jewish tefillin. Interestingly, a Shinto legend tells of a ninja who sought a certain Yamabushi named Tengu in order to receive supernatural powers. Tengu gave him a Torah no Maki, a scroll of the Torah which gave him special powers. End quote. Yeah, Shintoism is an entire Japanese belief system whose humble beginnings were based on Yaśareli shamanism. Mind you, the construction of Shinto shrines dates back to about the 600s BCE, yet suddenly changes to the Yaśareli architecture in the 300s BCE, which means word of Yaśarel's cultural impact in Japan had about 4 centuries to get back to Asia Minor for Jews to know about it. World History Encyclopedia tells us, quote, early shrines, which first appeared from around the 6th century BCE, often copied the architecture of thatched rice storehouses, but from the Nara period in the 8th century CE onwards, temple design was influenced by Chinese and especially Buddhist architecture, upturned gables, and a prodigious use of bright red paint and decorative elements. End quote. This proves how far back Shinto shrines go, the 500s BCE. That's exactly when the first wave of Yaśarelim should already have been migrating east on the steppe route and reaching ancient Mongolia. In fact, many should have arrived in the Far East already. Don't forget, Esdras said they journeyed a year and a half through Arsareth, to reach a further country. He wasn't measuring time when he said that. He was measuring distance a year and a half to the east. He has no clue how far east people can even go, but his society knows about Mongolia and China. Even the Yaśarelim, who were placed in the cities of the Medes, would likely have done this same thing without even having to consult with those in what's now northern Syria and Iraq. The Medes were in so-called northwestern Iran, so their own starting point was quite close to Kala and Habor. When the Babylonians wrested control from the Medes, capitalizing on the instability in the region would have again been a no-brainer, and north would have been the obvious escape route because it's the nearest exit from the hostile territory they're in. And yes, these Yaśarelim were black people. As we covered in previous videos, Leviticus 13 proves that they experienced leprosy as a whitening of the skin, and the absence of leprosy as quote-unquote somewhat dark flesh. Leprosy appears red on white and light brown skin tones, so these would have to be dark brown people. For an in-depth analysis of this and other passages that prove the complexion, check out my American Indian phenotype matches ancient Israelites video. Over time, the Yaśarelim in Japan and China became so yellow that they're almost white now. Several cultures from the Caucasus Society followed the same eastward expansion in many waves and gradually brought pale complexion to the region. In future presentations, we'll look at how the Yaśarelim came to look like modern Japanese people. By now, you should be wondering when I'm going to finally explain the mountain reference from this whole Harseries thing, though. So okay, it's saying Mountain of China, right? Well, why would the word mountain be relevant? It's relevant because the steppe route comes to an end in the east when it hits a mountain, which is likely the totality of what people in the Greco-Roman realm knew about the eastern end of the steppe route. Unbeknownst to them, that mountain at the end is actually part of a mountain range called the Altai mountain range. These mountains form a wall that separates the two routes you can take at the end of the steppe route. You can continue either southeast or northeast around the Altai mountains. It's not a long mountain range, but there was a whole Semitic society out there that was split into two halves by these mountains. On the Siberian side to the north, there were Hunnic Mongols, and on the Chinese side to the south were the Turco-Mongols. The northern side was probably a more even mix of Japhetic and Semitic ethnic groups by this time, but the southern side was still heavily Semitic, which is why they were still black by this time. The Altaic Mongol society is the origin of the ancestors of Chinggis Khan. We normally say Genghis Khan. We'll talk more about him in an upcoming presentation about how we know he himself was black, but if you chose the southeast path to pass the Altai Mountains, it would take you through what's now called Mongolia, and then directly to the Sea of Japan, which you could easily sail across to reach Japan itself. Lots of Yaśarelim migrated that way, and many of them didn't complete that journey to Japan because they joined the tribal confederacies of Mongolia and so-called China. We already looked at evidence of their presence in Japan, which we'll revisit in the future, but let's look at the people of the mainland at the time. In 2016, CNN did a special news blurb series for Black History Month, and they syndicated the articles from that series to various news outlets. The local ABC news station in eastern North Carolina was one of those outlets, and they published this blurb from that series. Look at the headline. Black History Month, the Black Mongols of China. It's only 3 paragraphs long. We're going to read the whole thing real quick. Quote, 1st century. Asia's first major encounter with Black Mongols occurred around the 1st century. They converged on India, conquering all of the northwest sector, which is now the nation of Pakistan. In China, they were called the Yuji. India referred to them as the Kusanas. Now known as the Black Huns, they traveled as much as 90 miles per day. When they invaded Eastern Europe, they were called the Black Tartars. James Brunson, an authority on the black racial presence in China, said, "These blacks referred to themselves as Karakatai and would later take possession of the steppe region north of the Black Sea." Now, I'm not saying that these people were Yaśarelim, but what I'm saying is that this was the Black Semitic society into which the Yaśarelim dispersed south of the Altai Mountains. We'll explore this society more in the future, but let's look at the northern side beyond the Altai Mountains. Lots of the Yaśarelim went that way too. This actually may be the road most taken by the specific Yaśareli migration we're talking about. The Huns to the north had a constant, ever-flowing migration pipeline that ventured even further north and sailed further east over icy waters into Alaska before pouring down through Canada. This was the trickle of nomads from various ethnic groups that made up what scholars now call the Na-Dene migration. Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, and Ephraim mixed into these people but became the bulk of that migration pipeline. It's a migration known to have occurred during the first millennium BCE. And you can see it and its time frame on this map thanks to the Atlas of Western Prehistory. These people became what we now call Navajo and Apache Indians. The region they came from around the Altaic Mountains is likely the general homeland of Arphaxad, the people who came to Sumer from the east. If you study the phonetics of the name Arphaxad, there's an unstressed vowel sound between the R and the P, but the P in Hebrew sounds like an F. Among the Turco-Mongolic peoples, some very likely would have pronounced this with a P sound while also enunciating the vowel, which would render this as Arphaxad. It's entirely possible that the exonym Arapaho, which is an American Indian name of completely unknown origin, is etymologically linked to this word. I'll unpack a theory on that in a different video. Utah is likely to be Huda or Judah for a different reason. These are all the kinds of things that would have to be separately explored. For further support of the idea that the late Jewish community knew where the lost tribes went, go back to 2nd Esdras. Even though the author is not reliable as an actual prophet of Yahweh, his perspective still shows us what the few remaining Jews in Syria-Palestina might have known about where those lost tribes went. Back to chapter 13, verses 43 and 44, quote, "And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow places of the river, for the Most High then showed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over." End quote. Now there's no reason to trust him for the alleged miracle that happened here. But you know what's interesting is which way he says they went. They crossed the narrow places of the Euphrates, except, well, there are no narrow places for the Euphrates. Most likely what he meant was that they crossed a tributary of the Euphrates, which is a narrow offshoot. As it so happens, the river Gozan, on which the city of Habor sits, is a tributary of the Euphrates. The Gozan technically is the Euphrates because it's a skinny branch of the Euphrates. Habor is called Tal Halaf now, remember? Crossing the river Gozan from Tal Halaf would mean venturing north, and if that's what they did, then they would be headed toward that corridor of Asia Minor I mentioned before. They'd be traveling toward the so-called Armenian highlands, and after passing through that, they'd just hug the west coast of the Caspian Sea to start following the steppe route through so-called northern Kazakhstan. The Jewish author of the middle of 2nd Esdras didn't see this in a vision. He heard it through the grapevine. This was information that made it back to Judea likely before this author was even born. And, well, I just spent most of this presentation demonstrating that this route was already the most logical escape path for Yaśarelim in Syria. Then the author says, quote, "For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Arsareth." End quote. He's making up a word out of Harsaris, which is Aramaic and Greek. That's Mountain of Mongolia, or Mount China. They had to journey a year and a half through Harsaris. That's how long it would take to get to their destinations on the other side of Harsaris, because that destination was North America. I know this has been complicated, so let's sum it up. 2nd Esdras is a colonizer text, but the chapter we focused on appears to have been written by a Jew because it's Aramaic, and too familiar with Yaśareli folklore to be Assyrian or whomever. The Jew says they escaped into one region but traveled to a further region, and through the second region they traveled a year and a half to reach their destination. So, the first region we're looking at is the Eurasian steppe, and the second region is Arsareth. Now, Arsareth is essentially referring to China, Siberia, and its connection to Alaska. Interestingly enough, that same region overlaps with what's known as Arphaxad. And we've also taken a closer look at the most prominent Jewish theory, which suggests that Arsareth might just be a misspelling of the word for another, like another land. But honestly, that theory makes the author seem less skilled with Hebrew than he probably was. Plus, it doesn't even align with Aramaic phonetics, which makes it a bit of a stretch. It's actually more plausible that non-Jewish scholars are correct when they propose that the author was combining the Hebrew and Aramaic word for mountain with the Greek term for China. After all, the Greeks were quite familiar with that region, and let's not forget, they made up a significant portion of his audience. Alright, so the tribes we can confidently identify here are Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, and Ephraim. Oh, and let's not forget Levi, specifically for the priesthoods within each tribe. Now, I'd say it's reasonable to estimate that we're talking about tens of thousands of people collectively from these 5 tribes making this journey. Of course, this happened over the span of a couple of centuries because, well, they wouldn't have all left at the same time. A smaller group from these tribes did migrate to North America. What's fascinating is how their numbers grew exponentially over time once they finally settled in the West. So, they were living in towns located in northern Iraq and Syria. It made the most sense for them to escape due north since, honestly, that was the closest exit out of Assyrian territory. They likely took advantage of several periods of instability in the region. That route led them directly to the steppe route, which by then was already infamous as a nomadic and mercantile traffic zone. From there, they traveled all the way to Mount China, which, by the way, is just the beginning of the Altai mountain range. They dispersed in several directions and left their mark on the growing culture of what's now Japan. The Nodine migration connects both chronologically and geographically with this theory, and serves as a direct pipeline into America during the first millennium. This accounts for Navajo and Apache, but it almost definitely accounts for lots of other tribes and bands who are classified as separate due to linguistic anthropology, like the Utah, now called Ute, or the Iowa, after whom Iowa is named, or the Atacapa, who call themselves Eshok, which is Isaac. Eshok would also connect them to Choctaw and Chickasha, because they were likely related. Certain Lower Creek Indians are also related to Choctaw and Chickasha, plus a litany of tribes throughout the East Coast from Seminole to Powhatan and up to the Lenape and other Algonquians. Aztec is not Israelite, but Nahua Aztec are. Mayans aren't Israelite, but Quiche Maya are. The Incans built temples so similar to the biblical descriptions of Solomon's temple that Mormons have been exploring the idea that they were so-called Nephites, which is what Mormons call Israelites who made the early migration to America. It's similar to the Japanese connection. In future presentations, we'll talk about ways to discern which American Indians are Yaśarelim and which aren't. But the point is that I hope this gets more of our people to see that we do have good reason to believe the Promised Land was in the Middle East, and that the migration routes would make sense. There's no simple explanation of any diaspora on the scale we're considering. Even in this case, the population I'm discussing doesn't represent the entire tribe of Reuben or Gad, for example. Other groups from these same tribes wound up elsewhere for different reasons to be explored in later videos. We didn't even address the real complications that come with the Persian captivity, which likely involved all 12 tribes. We didn't discuss how these same tribes also got to Africa and Australia, and as Isaiah 11:12 says, "And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Yaśarel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth."
And that's why you see within 100 years of each other, the Pashtun are formed, where there are 40, 50 million people today that say they're from the House of Israel and Afghanistan. You have Buddhism that pops up within 100 years, and the Shintoism, which is the oldest monarchy in the world, whose whole temple and worship is structured around some King Solomon first temple looking stuff. So you see a cultural boom within 100 years of the tribes of Israel going towards the Far East. So for me, there's no smoke without a fire. Well, look at Japan. They're a 2,600-year-old kingdom, the oldest kingdom in the world, the oldest monarchy in the world. They have a holy temple today in Mount Moriah in Japan. Mount Moriah is the same mountain where the King Solomon's temple were. The Japan temple today has 3 chambers. An outer chamber people celebrate, inner chamber where priests do sacrifices, and an inner chamber where they keep a golden ark on 4 poles with golden birds on it, and they keep 3 things in their ark. And the priests there wear these little phylactery called yamabushi, wear these little phylactery-looking devices on their foreheads. And they claim to be an ancient nation who was chosen, had a chosen homeland. They were exiled from their land and reestablished their kingdom here. So when you look at the Silk Road, at who's saying they're...
You will never find a kosher restaurant without sushi.
That's the joke about the whole thing. But that doesn't mean I'm saying that 10,000 Israelites showed up to Japan. It means an Israelite must have reached there at a certain point of their exile, as we were commanded to do. We were supposed to go to the 4 corners of the world. That's what the verse says we were supposed to do. The Israelites, we believe their purpose was to spread it across the Silk Road. When you look at history, it does. And I'm not that type of guy to be like, oh, I think you are. I found this because the Japanese people themselves are reporting on TV that they think they're from the House of Israel because of the legends and the connections.